Now, another important feature, kind of related to classes and objects in general, is the interfaces feature. And that's a feature which only exists in TypeScript, not in vanilla JavaScript. And any interface code which you write, which you'll see in a second, will therefore not be compiled to JavaScript. Now, what are interfaces? In their most basic form, interfaces are really just object type definitions. So we could say that we have a human object in our application, and we can define it with the interface keyword, then curly braces thereafter, and now here, between those curly braces, we can define the structure, the type of any human object we want to create. So we could say a human should have a first name, which is a string, and should maybe have an age, which is a number. And then let's say every human should also have a method to greet other humans. And for this we can add greet here, but now, very important, we don't add the method definition, we don't add the actual code that goes into that method, but instead just the type of that method, which we can do like this, for example. Now we're saying that every human should have a greet method, which actually is a method that takes no parameters and returns nothing. Now we can use this interface, as I just said, as an object type. So if I have a new variable named Max, because I want to store information about myself in there, then I could make it clear that this should be of type human, like this. And now if I want to assign a value, I'm not allowed to store a number. I am allowed to store an object, but only an object that has this structure. And I now also get auto-completion. And I have to make it clear that there is a first name, an age, and now I have to add a greet method as well. And here we now have the actual code, not the type definition. And now this works because this object, which I store in Max, fulfills the requirements set forth by that interface. So we can use interfaces to define object types. But we could also do this with the type keyword to create an alias. Like this. That would work as well. So why do we have interfaces then if we can do the same with the type keyword? Well, for one, of course, interfaces are simply an alternative, and you can use interfaces instead of the type keyword when you want to define object types, but they also have one other extra feature which the type keyword does not give you. Interfaces can be implemented by classes, and when they are, they force classes to have that structure defined by the interface. Now, this might sound very abstract, but this can be helpful if you're building an application with multiple developers and you want to ensure that a certain class written by another developer has a certain structure because you, for your part you are working on, need that class to have that structure. You need that class to have a certain method, for example. And it's the same for Angular. Angular, as you will see in this course, also has a couple of interfaces, which we will use from time to time in this course, which then force us to add certain features to the classes we define. And we will work with a lot of classes when working with Angular. And Angular gives us interfaces that force us to add certain features to our classes so that it then is able to use these classes correctly internally. And you'll see all of that in action throughout the course. Now I'll give you an example. Let's say I add a new class here, instructor, and I want to make sure that this class has this shape because someone else who's working on the team needs that class to have that shape. Then we can add the implements keyword and implement our interface before we add the curly braces to start defining the class. And now because I'm implementing this interface, I'm getting some red squiggly lines here, and I'm being forced to correctly implement this interface. Which means I have to add the first name property of type string here, I have to add a age property of type number here, and I have to add a greet method here. And only if I add all of that no matter which exact code I then have in that greet method. But only after I add the general structure here, this error goes away because I'm now correctly implementing this interface. And that's another key part of interfaces. They don't just act as object types, instead they also force us to set up a certain structure for our classes. And that's what we're taking advantage of here, and that's what we'll also see in action throughout this course. Now, to really conclude this TypeScript introduction section now, let's talk about configuring the TypeScript compiler. You might recall that before, when I executed just npx tsc, I got this error here that basically a TypeScript configuration file is missing, and that's why I had to target a specific TypeScript file like this to then compile just this file. Now, sometimes you want to compile all the TypeScript files in your project in one go, and you also might want to configure how the TypeScript compiler behaves. And for this, you can add a TypeScript compiler config file. You can do this with npx tsc-init. What this does is it adds a tsconfig.json file, though I will say, once we work with Angular, we don't need to do that because our Angular project got TypeScript configuration files out of the box, and you should really only change them if you know what you're doing. But here we now got such a TypeScript compiler configuration file, and in there we got lots of options which we can set. Now, one of the most important options is the strict mode option here, which by default is set to true. When using strict mode, TypeScript, as the name implies, does very strict type checking, and there are many things which it doesn't allow, like for example values where it's not able to infer the type. You then have to explicitly set a type for those. But that's just one example. Now, in general, you can read through this config file to understand these different settings, and of course I do talk about them in way greater detail in my full TypeScript course. As I said, with Angular projects, we get a TypeScript file out of the box, and therefore this is not really the focus here because this default Angular TypeScript compiler file will do the trick for us, and we don't really need to change them. Nonetheless, this is how you can configure the TypeScript compiler, and feel free to dive into these different options to play around with them. But with that, we now got all those important basics out of the way, and now with that, you're definitely ready to dive into Angular and TypeScript.